so total that it's very difficult for even people who follow this issue full time to keep track of what's going on. The very, very short version is that over the course of the last couple of months, the Ukrainians have advertised that they're going to launch a major invasion, counterattack in the Kherson region in an attempt to reclaim that territory. And we're going to include a link here as to what they were thinking with that. But instead, the bulk of Ukrainian forces seem to have somehow snuck all the way across Ukraine and sucker punched the Russians. The Russians did deploy maybe 10% of their troops from their eastern front to the Kherson region in an attempt to resupply because they knew that's where the attack was going to be. And as a result, they were unprepared for the Ukrainian assault.
The Russians have announced what they call a partial mobilization of about 300,000 troops. We may be seeing the beginning of the Russians' end here. It is still the Russians' war to lose. The Russian space is incredibly low value. The agriculture that exists there is very poor by global standards. So they've never been able to generate the amount of capital that's necessary to have a real road network. If you want to get anything moved from A to B, it's going to almost exclusively go by train, which is part of the reasons why logistics in the Russian army have become so poor, especially in the Ukraine conflict. And why the Ukrainians were able to take a couple of rail depots in eastern Ukraine, in Kharkiv, a couple weeks ago, and the front just collapsed. In fact, there's signs that we might be seeing a repeat of that elsewhere in the Donbass, as the Russians are now discovering that they're actually outnumbered locally, and that with all the captured equipment, the Ukrainians actually now have more artillery and more ammo. So if you take a poorly trained, conscripted force in Russia that is badly equipped and put it against a very motivated and enlarging force that is getting better training from abroad and better equipment from abroad in addition to the captured stuff, all of a sudden, at least for now, the balance of forces has really changed. And the only way that the Russians have ever been able to fight that sort of war is with more numbers. So they've had about 150,000 troops in area, plus the Chechens, plus their mercenaries. So let's just call it an even 200 for rounding. They're now going to add another 300. This doesn't mean that the nature of the war has fundamentally changed. It means two things. Number one, this is the sort of the Russians know how to fight. Just throw bodies after it. The Russians have always had a larger population than any of the countries they've gone to war with, and so they've always tried to win by numbers, and when they have won, that's usually how it has happened.
The Russians are literally dying out. And the post-Cold War generation that was born through the 1990s was so small that the Russians were losing the capacity to field a regular army. So if they didn't do it now, they would lose the possibility, and they would be then unanchored in this kind of great open flat zone in the middle of Eurasia, and the next time there's a war, they couldn't stop it. So they're hoping to forward position what they've got left in these gaps. And Ukraine, unfortunately, is between them and two of the most important gaps. So it's not just that they're going for Ukraine, they're going for Moldova, they're going for parts of Romania and Poland and all of Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania. It's just a question of timing. But Ukraine is the flavor of the month. I kind of see this war as the last conflict of the Cold War, because as long as the Russians existed, their security was going to drive their decision making. So it's kind of like how the Civil War was the final war of the American Revolution. We're kind of at the end of this section of history now. In any world where the United States is no longer banning war and is no longer regulating commerce in the way that we did during the Cold War and the post-Cold War period, the Russians were always going to go out and try to resecure what they see as the gateway invasion access corridors, places like the Polish Plain, the Bessarabian Gap, the Baltic Sea. They were always going to try to do this. One of the things we've seen in a lot of the authoritarian governments that are in existence right now, most notably Russia and China, is that their leadership has completely isolated themselves from the rest of the world. If you are in Putin's inner circle, you don't dare give him bad news because he will kill you. So there were a lot of assumptions that were made in the Kremlin that just have turned out to not be true. Now, in all due defense to Putin and the Kremlin, everyone in the West was thinking the same way.
I mean, if you look at the demographics, it is perfectly reasonable to assume that Putin was going to be the last leader of Russia anyway. A bit of an internal coup in that we had one faction that used to be part of the government take over the government because they thought that the previous two rulers, Khrushchev and Brezhnev, had mismanaged the system so badly that they really needed adults in the room, people who had the full picture of everything that was going on. And in a highly censored totalitarian dictatorship, that meant the intelligence services. So the KGB generated Yuri Chernenko and ultimately Gorbachev, all from the KGB, to run the system. Well, these people
stayed in, I wouldn't even call it the background. They weren't officially in charge, but they were always large and present in the 1990s. And when Yeltsin took ill, they're the ones who took over from Yeltsin. So we had a quick revolution, lasted a few years, then Yeltsin got dropped because his health was atrocious. And the KGB has been in the KGB's successor, the FSB, has been in charge of ever since. Now, Putin is obviously from that crowd, but so has everyone around him. Alexei Miller of Gazprom is probably the best example. But the chiefs of all of the major companies that they're called the Silivarchs, the security oligarchs, that have taken over chunks of the Russian economy in large bites ever since 1999. They are all personally beholden to Putin. They are all from that inner circle, and they are all over 50.